The stillness of the upstairs suite at 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard is absolute, a silence preserved under the strict seal of family decree since the afternoon of August 16th, 1977. While the crushing humidity of a Memphis summer hangs heavy over the limestone portico below, the air within the master sanctuary remains artificially chilled just as he preferred it, a climate-controlled fortress against the Tennessee heat. It was here, on a rolling 19-acre rise in the Whitehaven district, that the young colossus of American culture sought to build a world that could contain him. The deed, signed in the spring of 1957, transferred the classical revival mansion from the established Moore family to a 22-year-old disruptor, promising a pastoral refuge of white columns and oak trees. Yet, looking at the architectural modifications that followed, the thick drapes, the perimeter walls, the internal monitors, one sees not a monument to triumph, but a slow, gilded suffocation. The house was designed to keep the world out, but in the end, it only succeeded in locking the silence in. In the years before the myth arrived, the estate was a quiet testament to Southern gentry ambition. Commissioned in 1939 by Dr. Thomas Moore and his wife Ruth Brown Moore, the residence was named Graceland, in honor of Ruth's great-aunt, Grace Tooffe, whose family had held the land for generations in the rolling farmland south of Memphis. The Tooffe family had farmed these acres since the early 19th century, and the name carried the weight of old Southern lineage, a connection to the land that predated the Civil War, the kind of roots that mattered in a city still conscious of pedigree. The architectural firm of Furbringer and Ehrman, respected practitioners of Memphis's pre-war building establishment, designed a balanced neoclassical structure intended to project the quiet confidence of professional success. The residence presented 5 bays of Tishomingo limestone, quarried from northeastern Mississippi, the same pale stone that fronted county courthouses and bank buildings across the Mid-South, arranged in symmetrical dignity. 4 fluted Corinthian columns supported a modest portico, their capitals carved with the restrained acanthus leaves that mark serious architecture, not showmanship. The roof line was low-pitched, the windows proportioned according to Georgian principles, the whole composition speaking a language of continuity rather than disruption. Inside, the original floor plan followed the center hall tradition, a wide entrance corridor dividing the ground floor into formal rooms on either side, with a graceful staircase rising along the north wall. The living room opened to the right, the music room to the left, both spaces designed for afternoon light and the gentle circulation of guests during garden parties. Ceilings measured a comfortable 9 feet, neither oppressive nor ostentatious. Oak floors glowed under layers of hand-rubbed finish. The second floor contained 4 bedrooms arranged around a central hallway, each with generous windows that invited the Tennessee breeze. Dr. Moore, a respected physician, had built the house as a retirement project, a place to host grandchildren, to cultivate roses in the side garden, to sit on the columned porch in the evening and watch the sun drop behind the oak trees that lined the property. Photographs from the early 1940s, preserved in Memphis archives, show a house settled comfortably into its landscape. Foundation plantings of azaleas and boxwood, a gravel drive curving through mowed lawns, the limestone facade warm in afternoon light. It was architecture designed to age gracefully, to pass from one generation to the next with only minor adjustments, a house built for continuity in a world that still believed in it. But by the mid-1950s, the estate's pastoral seclusion was under siege. Highway 51, rechristened Bellevue Boulevard and later Elvis Presley Boulevard, had evolved from a country road into a commercial artery lined with drive-in restaurants, used car lots, and the neon sprawl of post-war consumer culture. The Moore family, aging and unable to maintain the property's demands, placed it on the market in early 1957. In the real estate listings, Graceland was described as a colonial mansion on approximately 14 acres, a genteel understatement that could not anticipate what was coming. The quiet hill, with its white columns and oak shade, was waiting for a new kind of royalty, one that would trade the subtle dignity of old money for the electric urgency of the new. By the spring of 1957, the psychological need for a fortress had already taken root in Elvis Presley. At 22, he had spent less than 3 years in the public eye, but those years had been compressing and distorting, collapsing the normal rhythms of fame into a white-hot acceleration. The Sun Records sessions in 1954, the RCA contract in late 1955, the television appearances that scandalized and electrified in equal measure, each milestone had tightened the noose of public attention. By early 1957, he could not walk a Memphis street without triggering a riot. His family's modest ranch house at 1034 Audubon Drive, purchased with his first substantial royalties in 1956, had become a pilgrimage site. The lawn perpetually trampled by fans who pressed against the windows and tore shrubbery for souvenirs. Vernon and Gladys Presley, bewildered by their son's ascent, had watched their suburban refuge dissolve into chaos. In interviews preserved by Memphis newspaper archives, neighbors described the daily siege. Tour buses idling at the curb, teenagers camping overnight on the grass, the constant flash of cameras through the picture window. The Audubon Drive house, built for middle-class privacy, offered no defense against this kind of devotion. There were no gates, no buffer, no architectural vocabulary for separating the icon from the man who lived inside. In March 1957, Elvis's business manager, Vernon Presley, and Memphis realtor Virginia Grant began the search for something more defensible. The requirements were specific: enough land to create distance, walls, or fencing to establish a perimeter, and a structure substantial enough to announce permanence. The search led them south on Highway 51 to the Moore estate, where the limestone facade and mature trees promised both dignity and seclusion. On March 19, 1957, Elvis paid a visit. Photographs from that day, held in the Graceland archives, show him standing on the front steps with Vernon and Gladys, his mother's hand resting tentatively on the iron railing, her expression caught between wonder and apprehension. The purchase contract, executed through Memphis Title Company and preserved in Shelby County property records, transferred ownership on March 26, 1957, for $102,500, a sum that represented roughly 3 months of Elvis's income at that moment, a fortune to his parents, a negligible expense to the machinery of his career. The deed listed Elvis Aaron Presley as sole owner, but the psychological ownership was more complicated. In every interview Elvis gave about the house in those early years, he emphasized one fact above all others: I bought it for my mother. The move from Audubon Drive to Graceland took place over several days in May 1957, documented in local news footage that shows a chaotic caravan of Cadillacs, pickup trucks, and moving vans winding up the driveway. Elvis's pink Cadillac, that totemic vehicle of his early success, led the procession, followed by furniture, clothes, guitars, and the accumulated debris of sudden wealth. Gladys Presley, in her floral print dress, stood on the limestone steps and wept, overcome by the scale of what her son had purchased. For her, raised in the shotgun shacks and tenant farms of rural Mississippi, the columned mansion must have seemed less like a home than a museum, a space too grand for daily life. But for Elvis, the estate represented something more urgent than domestic comfort. It was a perimeter, a psychological bulwark against the world that wanted to consume him. The initial architectural interventions, begun almost immediately after the purchase, reveal this defensive impulse with striking clarity. The first modification was the installation of custom gates, fabricated by the Tennessee Fabricating Company under the direction of owner Abe Sauer. The gates were completed and installed in April 1957, even before the family had fully moved in. The design, wrought iron formed into musical notes and a stylized guitar player frozen mid-performance, balanced whimsy with function. The iconography was deliberately transparent. Any passing motorist could see through the bars to the house beyond, could recognize the musical motifs that identified the estate's owner. But transparency was not the same as access. The gates, hinged on brick pillars topped with decorative musical notes, established an inviolable line. On one side, the public, the fans, the world. On the other, the beginning of a private kingdom. Estate records from mid-1957, held in the Graceland archives, document the next phase of fortification. A stone wall, built to match the existing fencing and extending roughly 500 feet along the Highway 51 frontage, was completed by summer's end. The wall measured approximately 6 feet in height, not high enough to completely obscure the house, but sufficient to discourage casual trespass. Security lights were installed at intervals along the perimeter. An intercom system was wired from the gates to the house, allowing Vernon or household staff to screen visitors before admitting them. Inside the house, the renovations balanced Gladys's domestic needs with Elvis's emerging aesthetic. The ground floor saw relatively modest changes in that first year. New carpeting in deep blues and golds, custom drapery to soften the classical severity of the rooms, the addition of a television set in the living room, a luxury still novel enough to be remarked upon in fan magazines. But the most significant architectural gesture was the conversion of a downstairs bedroom, just off the kitchen, into a private suite for Gladys. The decision to place his mother on the ground floor, in a space easily accessible from the domestic heart of the house, spoke to Elvis's protective instincts. She would not have to climb stairs. She would remain close to the kitchen, where she felt competent and in control. The downstairs bedroom became Gladys's sanctuary, documented in photographs that show a modest space furnished with simple pieces: a brass bed, a nightstand, a rocking chair positioned near the window. The walls were painted a soft yellow. Family photographs in dime store frames clustered on the dresser. Here, in this room, Gladys could retreat from the overwhelming grandeur of the house's public spaces, could imagine herself back in the shotgun shacks of her youth, where rooms were small and walls were close and life was comprehensible. Elsewhere in the house, the sensory texture of daily life began to imprint itself on the architecture. The smell of Gladys's cooking, country ham, biscuits, greens simmered with fatback, drifted through the formal dining room and softened the austere elegance of the Moores' decorating choices. Gospel records played on the hi-fi in the music room. Mahalia Jackson and the Blackwood Brothers, their voices rising toward the 9-foot ceilings. The sound of Elvis's laughter echoed in the entrance hall. his footsteps loud on the oak floors, his restless energy already beginning to chafe against the house's genteel proportions. But even in those early months, the seeds of a darker architecture were being planted. On the staircase landing, where the steps turned and rose toward the second floor, Elvis ordered the installation of a privacy wall, a half-height partition that blocked the view from the ground floor into the upper hallway. The modification was subtle, almost unremarkable, but it established a principle that would govern the house's evolution. The upstairs was not public space. It was not for guests, not for tours, not for the prying eyes of the world. The second floor, from that moment forward, belonged to Elvis alone, a domain accessible only by invitation. In photographs from late 1957, preserved in fan magazines and wire service archives, Graceland appears as a curious hybrid, a southern plantation mansion colonized by the artifacts of rock and roll. The limestone columns still stand in classical dignity, but parked in the circular drive are Elvis's growing fleet of Cadillacs, pink, white, and powder blue, their chrome blazing in the Tennessee sun. The oak trees still shade the lawn, but the grass is beginning to show the wear of constant foot traffic, trampled by delivery trucks and visiting musicians and the endless stream of hangers-on who had already begun to orbit the young star. Inside, the house sounded different from the way Dr. Moore had imagined. Where he had heard the murmur of polite conversation and the clink of iced tea glasses on silver trays, the walls now absorbed the thump of bass and the shouts of impromptu jam sessions. Where he had envisioned grandchildren playing quietly in the side garden, there were now motorcycles and go-karts tearing across the lawn. The house, built for a world of restraint and decorum, was learning the vocabulary of excess. Yet beneath the chaos, there was a tenderness, a naivete that would not survive the decade. In those early years, Elvis still believed that walls and gates could protect what mattered, that if he built the perimeter strong enough, high enough, if he controlled access with sufficient vigilance, he could preserve a space where he was simply a son, a brother, a man who liked to sing. The architecture of Graceland in 1957 still served a maternal function, a safe harbor for Gladys, a refuge where her bewilderment at her son's fame might be softened by familiar smells and comfortable chairs. But history was already writing a different script. The house that was meant to shelter the family would, within 2 decades, become the symbol of isolation's cost. A fortress that kept the world out but could not keep the darkness from seeping in. The interior transformation of Graceland during the late 1950s unfolded in layers, each renovation both expressing and accelerating Elvis's drift away from the conventions of the world he had bought into. The changes began modestly enough, cosmetic adjustments to suit a young man's tastes. But by 1960, the house had become something else entirely. Not a classical mansion occupied by a rock star, but a shrine to the star's own mythology, a space where every surface reflected and amplified his image. The first major intervention came in late 1957, when Elvis commissioned the installation of wall-to-wall carpeting throughout the ground floor. The choice of material and color was telling, not the neutral tones favored by decorators of the period, but deep, saturated hues. Royal blue in the living room, crimson in the dining room, emerald green in the music room. The carpets were thick, almost plush, with a pile so deep that footsteps disappeared into silence. The effect was to muffle the house, to deaden the acoustic sharpness of the Moore's hardwood floors and classical proportions. Where the original architecture had encouraged sound to travel and reverberate, Elvis's renovations absorbed it, creating pockets of acoustic isolation within the larger structure. The drapery followed the same principle. Custom-made panels, ordered through a Memphis decorator and installed in early 1958, covered nearly every window on the ground floor. The fabric was heavy, velvets, brocades, damasks, in colors that matched or complemented the carpets. When drawn, which they often were, the drapes sealed the rooms into a perpetual twilight, disconnecting the interior from the passage of the sun across the Tennessee sky. Visitors who entered Graceland during this period remarked on the disorientation. Stepping from the bright southern daylight into rooms where time seemed suspended, where day and night lost their distinction. Estate records from 1958, preserved in purchase orders and invoices held by the Graceland archives, document the addition of custom furniture, oversized sofas and armchairs upholstered in velvets and leathers, glass-topped coffee tables, mirrored side tables, and a growing collection of tchotchkes, decorative pieces purchased on impulse or received as gifts from fans and industry figures. The aesthetic was eclectic, untutored, a collision of influences that ranged from Hollywood glamour to Deep South comfort to the nascent vocabulary of Las Vegas excess. Nothing about the decor suggested the careful curation of inherited taste. Everything spoke of sudden wealth and the freedom to indulge every passing fancy. But the most psychologically significant modification during this period was the gradual solidification of the upstairs as forbidden territory. By 1959, Elvis had claimed the master bedroom, the largest of the second-floor rooms, positioned at the front of the house with windows overlooking the circular drive, as his private domain. The room, roughly 18 by 20 feet with a vaulted ceiling, was redecorated in shades of blue and gold. A king-size bed, custom-made to accommodate Elvis's 6-foot frame and his restless sleep habits, dominated the space. Blackout curtains, installed at his specific request, sealed the windows against daylight. A television set, mounted on a swivel stand, faced the bed. A bookshelf, filled with spiritual texts and Hollywood biographies, lined one wall. The room's decor was less remarkable than its function. It became the nerve center of Elvis's increasingly nocturnal existence. By 1959, his schedule had inverted. He slept through the daylight hours and woke in the late afternoon or early evening, beginning his day as the rest of Memphis prepared for sleep. The second-floor master bedroom, sealed against the sun and acoustically isolated from the ground floor by the thickness of plaster and the density of carpet, became a timeless capsule where the normal rhythms of circadian life dissolved. Architectural historians who have studied Graceland's evolution note that the upstairs transformation paralleled Elvis's psychological withdrawal from ordinary social engagement. The more famous he became, the less he participated in the public rituals of Memphis society. The country clubs, the civic organizations, the polite dinners that defined upper-middle-class Southern life. Instead, he created his own society within the walls of Graceland, a nocturnal court governed by his whims and sustained by the growing entourage of friends, cousins, and employees who filled the house. The bathroom adjacent to the master bedroom underwent its own evolution. Originally a modest space with standard fixtures, it was expanded and redesigned in 1959-1960 to serve dual functions: as a dressing room and as a de facto pharmacy. Medicine cabinets installed along one wall began to accumulate the prescriptions that would eventually define Elvis's final years. Though in this early period, They contained mostly the ordinary remedies of a young man prone to insomnia and anxiety. The bathroom's mirrors, edge-lit and expansive, allowed Elvis to examine himself from multiple angles, a necessity for someone whose image was his primary currency. But while Elvis withdrew upward, his mother remained rooted on the ground floor, in the modest bedroom off the kitchen. The spatial segregation was both practical and symbolic. Gladys, increasingly unwell and uncomfortable with the scale of her son's fame, rarely ventured to the second floor. Her world contracted to a circuit of familiar rooms: her bedroom, the kitchen, the small breakfast nook where she could sit and watch the driveway. Photographs from this period, taken by family and preserved in the archives, show her seated in her rocking chair, her expression distant, her hands idle in her lap. The house that Elvis had built for Mama had become too large for her to inhabit, its grandeur a reproach to the simple life she had known. The architecture of class separation within the house also began to solidify. The kitchen and its adjacent spaces, laundry room, pantry, staff quarters, formed a separate zone, accessed through a back hallway that kept domestic labor invisible from the public rooms. Household staff, primarily African American women, hired from Memphis's working-class neighborhoods, entered through a side door and moved through service corridors designed to minimize their visibility. The original Moores had employed this same architectural logic, but under Elvis's tenure, the household staff expanded dramatically, creating a shadow population within the walls. Estate. Payroll records from 1959, held in Graceland's business archives, list a cook, a housekeeper, 2 maids, a groundskeeper, and a maintenance man, an establishment staff for a house that, despite its grandeur, was still primarily occupied by just 3 people: Elvis, Vernon, and Gladys. The disparity between the house's capacity and its actual residential population created vast pockets of emptiness. Entire rooms on the second floor, the guest bedrooms, the sewing room, the storage spaces, remained largely unused, their furniture draped in sheets, their windows perpetually curtained. In August 1958, this careful equilibrium shattered. Gladys Presley, only 46 years old but worn down by a combination of hepatitis, cirrhosis, and the emotional strain of her son's fame, died at Methodist Hospital in Memphis. The funeral, held at Graceland on August 14, 1958, transformed the house into a public stage for grief. Photographs from that day, preserved in news archives, show the limestone facade draped in black bunting, the circular drive choked with cars, and Elvis, home on emergency leave from his Army service, barely able to stand, his face contorted with a grief so raw that even the cameras seemed to recoil. After Gladys's death, the house changed. Her bedroom, off the kitchen, was left largely untouched, a shrine to her memory that Vernon and Elvis could not bear to disturb. The gospel records stopped playing. The smell of her cooking faded from the air. The downstairs rooms, which had been animated by her presence, fell into a heavy quiet. Elvis, returning to Germany to complete his Army service, left Graceland in a kind of suspended animation. Vernon remained, rattling around in the oversized house, but without Gladys's maternal gravity, the estate lost its domestic center. When Elvis returned in March 1960, discharged from the Army and poised to relaunch his career, he came back to a house that was no longer a home. It was a stage, a fortress, a monument, but it was not the place where his mother had rocked in her chair and hummed along to Mahalia Jackson. From this point forward, Graceland's evolution would accelerate, driven not by the need to shelter a family, but by the compulsion to construct a world entirely separate from the one beyond the gates, a world where Elvis could remain the king, insulated from the forces that had already begun to erode the man beneath the crown. As the 1960s progressed, Graceland evolved from a family home into what might be described, without exaggeration, as a barracks for a Praetorian Guard. The Memphis Mafia, a term coined by the press to describe the brotherhood of bodyguards, cousins, childhood friends, and professional fixers who surrounded Elvis, became part of the estate's living infrastructure, their presence shaping the architecture as profoundly as any formal renovation. The core members of this entourage included men whose names would become inseparable from Elvis's mythology. Red, West, his high school friend, who served as chief bodyguard. Sonny West, Red's cousin, hired for the same muscle. Joe Esposito, a meticulous organizer who functioned as road manager and de facto chief of staff. Charlie Hodge, a musician and constant companion. Marty Lacker, who handled logistics. Lamar Fike, whose size and loyalty made him both bodyguard and court jester. And Alan Fortas, named for the Supreme Court justice and employed primarily for loyalty rather than any specific skill. These men, along with a rotating cast of others, formed the human wall between Elvis and the world. By 1961, Graceland's architectural adaptations to accommodate this small army had begun in earnest. The first modification was the conversion of outbuildings. A small guest house at the rear of the property, originally intended for groundskeepers, was renovated into apartments for Red and Sonny West. A second structure, closer to the main house, was similarly converted to house other members of the entourage. These buildings, modest in scale but equipped with kitchenettes and private baths, allowed the Memphis Mafia to live on the estate, available at all hours, but physically separated from the main house's domestic spaces. The modifications reflected a principle that would govern Graceland's social architecture for the next 15 years: proximity without intimacy. The Memphis Mafia needed to be close enough to respond instantly to Elvis's summons, but segregated enough that their presence did not intrude on his privacy. Architectural plans from this period, preserved in the Graceland archives, show the careful zoning of the estate into concentric rings of access. The core, Elvis's second-floor bedroom; the inner circle, the ground floor public rooms where the entourage gathered; and the outer ring, the converted outbuildings and staff quarters. Inside the main house, technological infrastructure evolved to support this new social order. In 1962-1963, a sophisticated intercom system was installed, wired from the master bedroom to every major room in the house and extending to the gates and outbuildings. The system allowed Elvis to communicate with anyone on the property without leaving his bedroom, a convenience that gradually calcified into a mode of existence. Accounts from Memphis Mafia members, documented in memoirs and interviews, describe the nightly ritual. Elvis's voice, crackling through the intercom speakers, summoning individuals to the upstairs bedroom, or announcing his intention to come downstairs, giving the household time to prepare for his appearance. The intercom system, seemingly innocuous, had profound psychological effects. It allowed Elvis to manage the estate as a kind of command center, to monitor and control movement without direct observation. It eliminated the need for face-to-face encounters, permitting him to issue orders and receive reports while remaining physically removed. The architecture, designed originally for domestic warmth and social gathering, was being rewired into a surveillance apparatus. The Memphis Mafia's daily routines further transformed the house's rhythms. Because Elvis slept during the day and woke in the late afternoon or evening, the entourage adopted the same schedule. Graceland became a nocturnal kingdom, its lights blazing through the night, its windows shrouded during the day. Neighbors, interviewed by Memphis newspapers in the mid-1960s, remarked on the estate's eerie inversion, silent and dark when the rest of Whitehaven was awake, loud and glowing when normal households slept. The ground floor rooms evolved to support this nocturnal life. The dining room, originally intended for formal meals, became a gathering place for late-night feasts, catered by Elvis's cook, Mary Jenkins. Accounts from this period describe tables laden with country cooking, fried chicken, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, cornbread, served at midnight or later, the chandelier glowing above the remnants of a world that no longer observed normal meal times. The music room, with its television and hi-fi, became the site of marathon movie screenings and listening sessions. Elvis and his entourage sprawled on sofas, watching films until dawn. But the most architecturally significant modification of this period was the increasing fortification of the second floor. By 1964, the privacy wall on the staircase landing had been supplemented by additional barriers. A heavy door, upholstered in padded fabric, was installed at the top of the stairs, creating a physical valve that controlled access to the upper floor. The door could be locked from the inside, and its padding muffled sound, creating an acoustic seal that isolated the master bedroom from the activity below. This door, more than any other architectural element, symbolized Graceland's transformation from home to fortress. On one side, the public performance of Elvis's life, the laughter and music and controlled chaos of the entourage. On the other, the private reality, the insomnia and spiritual searching and growing dependence on prescription medications that characterized Elvis's interior life. The architecture, by creating this rigid boundary, enabled a dangerous bifurcation. The image could be maintained downstairs, while the man deteriorated upstairs, and the two realms need never confront each other. The Memphis Mafia, for their part, understood their role in maintaining this illusion. Memoirs and interviews reveal a culture of loyalty bordering on omerta, a code of silence about what happened upstairs, about Elvis's increasingly erratic behavior, about the prescriptions that arrived by mail, and the doctors who made house calls with locked medical bags. The entourage served as both enablers and buffers, managing Elvis's interface with reality while insulating him from its harshest truths. Security protocols tightened throughout the mid-1960s. The gates were now monitored around the clock by rotating shifts of guards, many of them off-duty Memphis police officers hired for overtime pay. A logbook, preserved in the Graceland archives, recorded every vehicle that entered or exited the property, noting the time, the driver, and the purpose of the visit. Visitors to the main house were screened by the Memphis Mafia, their credentials evaluated, their loyalties assessed before they were admitted through the front door. The estate's perimeter expanded as well. In 1965, Elvis purchased adjacent lots, increasing Graceland's acreage and pushing the fence line farther from the house. The additional land provided buffer space, but it also signaled a broader pattern. The more famous Elvis became, the more physical distance he required between himself and the public. The gates that had seemed whimsical in 1957 now appeared almost clinical in their efficiency, a tourniquet around a hemorrhaging privacy. Inside this fortified world, a strange domesticity took hold. The Memphis Mafia and their families, several members married during this period, formed a kind of parallel community dependent on Elvis for employment, housing, and social identity. Children of Memphis Mafia members played on the Graceland lawn, attended by nannies, their laughter echoing against the limestone facade. Wives gathered in the converted outbuildings, trading gossip and managing the logistics of a life lived in orbit around Elvis's gravitational pull. Yet for all this activity, the house remained fundamentally a stage set rather than a home. Rooms were decorated and redecorated, but never fully inhabited. The grand piano in the music room, a Naba baby grand purchased in the early 1960s, was played primarily by guests. Elvis himself preferred the comfort of his bedroom, where a smaller, upright piano allowed him to compose in solitude. The living room, with its ornate furniture and museum-quality stillness, saw little actual living. It was a space preserved for photographs, for the occasional television interview, for the maintenance of appearances. Photographs from the mid-1960s, taken by Memphis Mafia members and preserved in private collections, reveal the estate's dual nature. In some images, Graceland appears as a playground. Elvis and his entourage racing go-karts on the lawn, splashing in the swimming pool, roughhousing on the front steps. In others, the house looms empty and silent, its windows dark rectangles, its columns standing like sentinels over an abandoned parade ground. By 1968, the architectural and social structures of Graceland had solidified into a system, what might be termed, without hyperbole, the isolation system. It was a machine designed to protect Elvis from the world, to manage his image while concealing his vulnerabilities, to maintain the fiction of the king, while the man inside the mansion grew increasingly fragile. The system worked after a fashion. Elvis remained, in the public imagination, an icon of vitality and charisma. But the cost of maintaining that illusion was mounting, accumulating in the sealed rooms upstairs, in the prescription bottles in the bathroom cabinets, in the sleepless nights and chemically induced days that had become the rhythm of his existence. The Memphis Mafia, for all their loyalty and dedication, could not halt this slow erosion. They were part of the architecture, essential components of the isolation system, and the system itself had become the problem. Graceland, designed as a refuge, had become a cocoon, comfortable, protective, and ultimately suffocating. In the mid-1970s, a period of frantic redecoration seized Graceland, transforming the estate's interior from Southern eclectic into something approaching psychedelic fever dream. The modifications, executed between 1974 and 1976, reflected Elvis's restless pursuit of novelty and distraction, his compulsion to remake his environment when he could not remake himself. Of all the renovations during this period, none better captured the estate's descent into architectural surrealism than the construction of what would become known, with appropriate irony, as the Jungle Room. The project began in late 1974, when Elvis visited a Memphis furniture store and encountered a collection of Polynesian-themed pieces, heavy wooden chairs, and sofas carved with tiki faces, their arms and backs encrusted with faux primitive ornamentation. The furniture was aggressively tactile, almost weaponized in its commitment to texture, rough-hewn wood, vinyl upholstery in patterns suggesting animal hide, carved faces frozen in grimaces of aboriginal intensity. Elvis purchased the entire collection on impulse and ordered it installed in the ground floor den, a room that had previously served as a generic family space. But the furniture alone was not enough. To create a complete environment, Elvis commissioned additional modifications documented in contractor receipts and photographs from the Graceland archives. Green shag carpet, not merely on the floor, but extending up the walls and across the ceiling, transformed the room into a carpeted cave. The pile was thick, almost mossy, giving the space a dampened acoustic quality, as though sound itself were being absorbed into vegetation. A stone waterfall, complete with pump and recirculating water system, was built into one corner, its mechanical burble providing constant ambient noise. The effect was disorienting, deliberately so. Where the rest of Graceland maintained at least a tenuous connection to classical proportions and Southern decor, the Jungle Room rejected those conventions entirely. It was a den, a womb, a retreat into manufactured primitivism, a space where the trappings of civilization dissolved into fantasy. Visitors who entered the room during this period, according to their memoirs and interviews, described a sense of temporal dislocation, as though stepping from 1970s Tennessee into some vague approximation of a South Pacific longhouse. The room's function was equally confused. Ostensibly a den for relaxation, it became, paradoxically, a recording studio. In February and October 1976, RCA brought portable recording equipment to Graceland, and Elvis cut what would be his final studio tracks in the Jungle Room. His voice captured by microphones positioned among the tiki furniture and shag carpet. The acoustic properties of the carpeted surfaces, their tendency to deaden reverb and absorb high frequencies, gave these recordings a muffled, intimate quality, as though Elvis were singing from inside a padded cell. The Jungle Room renovation was part of a broader pattern of interior modification that swept through Graceland in the mid-1970s. In 1974, the living room was redecorated in shades of icy blue and white, with a 15-foot white sofa and glass coffee tables that reflected the chandelier above in fractured geometries. The dining room received gold lame curtains, their metallic sheen catching light and throwing it back in harsh glints. The music room was repainted in deep navy, its grand piano now lost in shadows and less spotlit. But the most psychologically revealing element of this decorating frenzy was the pervasive use of mirrors. Throughout the ground floor, in the hallway leading from the entrance to the music room, in the television room, in the bathrooms, mirrors multiplied and fragmented space. In some areas, entire walls were sheathed in mirrored panels, creating the illusion of infinite depth, rooms extending into themselves forever. Architecturally, mirrors expand space, a decorator's trick to make small rooms feel larger. But in Graceland, where space was already abundant, the mirrors served a different function. They created a hall of reflections where Elvis could never escape his own image. Walking through the mirrored hallway, he encountered himself from multiple angles, his figure doubled and redoubled, the icon and the man forced into perpetual confrontation. For someone whose image was his currency, whose face had been reproduced on millions of album covers and movie posters, the mirrors at Graceland transformed his home into an echo chamber of self, a space where identity fragmented into infinite copies, none quite certain which was the original. The color palette of this period also warrants analysis. Where the late 1950s and early 1960s had favored rich but recognizable hues, blues, golds, crimsons, The mid-1970s renovations embraced extremes: acid greens, metallic golds, stark whites, and blacks so deep they seemed to absorb light. These were not the colors of domestic comfort, but of stage lighting, of Las Vegas showrooms, of spaces designed to dazzle rather than soothe. Graceland, room by room, was being transformed from a residence into a performance venue, a house that existed primarily to be photographed, to project an image of eccentric opulence. In 1974, Elvis made another significant addition: a television room constructed in what had been a screened porch at the rear of the house. The space was small, roughly 12 by 15 feet, but its decoration was maximalist. The walls were covered in fabric, yellow, black, and white in bold geometric patterns. The ceiling was mirrored, creating the illusion of infinite vertical space. And along one wall, 3 television sets were mounted side by side, a detail Elvis borrowed from President Lyndon Johnson's White House study. The 3 television setup was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it allowed Elvis to monitor multiple news channels simultaneously, to scan the cultural landscape without committing to any single narrative. Symbolically, it represented his relationship to reality, mediated, fragmented, observed through screens rather than experienced directly. In this small, mirror-ceilinged room, Elvis could watch the world watching him, the screens broadcasting his films, his concert specials, the news coverage of his career. While he sat entombed in yellow and black fabric, his reflection duplicated overhead. The television room, like the jungle room, functioned as an architectural retreat, a space within a space, layered defenses against the outside world. Visitors to Graceland during this period, according to Memphis Mafia accounts, describe Elvis's preference for these smaller, more enclosed areas. The grand spaces of the house, the living room with its chandeliers, the dining room with its long table, went increasingly unused. Elvis gravitated toward the rooms that felt like caves, spaces where the architecture pressed close, where ceilings were low or mirrored, where walls were padded or carpeted, where the boundaries of self and space could blur. Interior designers who have studied Graceland's 1970s incarnation note the paradox. These were years of Elvis's greatest wealth and fame, yet his architectural choices moved consistently toward enclosure and confinement. Where successful people typically express their status through expansiveness, higher ceilings, larger rooms, panoramic views, Elvis's modifications worked in the opposite direction, creating pockets of increasingly compressed space within the mansion's classical shell. The decorating choices also revealed a disconnection from external aesthetic judgment. The jungle room, the mirrored hallway, the yellow television room. These were not designs calculated to impress visitors or reflect cultural sophistication. They were intensely personal spaces, almost autistic in their commitment to specific sensory experiences: texture, color, reflected light, ambient sound. Elvis was no longer decorating for an audience. He was constructing environments that matched some interior landscape, rooms that externalized his psychological state. By 1976, Graceland's ground floor had become a kind of architectural autobiography, written in shag carpet and mirrored glass. Each room told a story about Elvis's evolving relationship with his own image, his growing need for mediated reality, his flight from the expectations of conventional taste. The house, built by Dr. Moore to project Southern gentry respectability, had been thoroughly colonized by its owner's idiosyncratic vision, a vision that mixed nostalgia for a Southern childhood he'd barely lived with the glittering excess of Las Vegas showrooms, producing a hybrid aesthetic that was uniquely, undeniably, tragically Elvis. Yet even as the ground floor underwent these transformations, the upstairs remained largely unchanged from its 1960s configuration. The second floor, that forbidden zone behind the padded door, existed in a different temporal and aesthetic register. While the jungle room sprouted green shag carpet and the television room multiplied itself in mirrors, the master bedroom upstairs maintained its simpler decor. Blue and gold, blackout curtains, the same custom bed, the same vaulted ceiling, the same acoustic isolation. It was as though Graceland contained two separate architectures, the performative spaces downstairs, constantly redecorated to match Elvis's shifting moods and the demands of photographers, and the private sanctuary upstairs, preserved in amber, unchanging, the eye of the decorating storm. The house, like its owner, was divided against itself, one half reaching for novelty and distraction, the other retreating into familiar darkness, both halves increasingly unable to reconcile. By 1975, the physical security of Graceland had hardened from careful management into something approaching clinical paranoia. The transformation was documented in equipment purchases, architectural modifications, and the memories of those who maintained the estate's surveillance apparatus. An electronic panopticon that allowed Elvis to monitor his kingdom without ever leaving the master bedroom. The installation of a closed-circuit television (CCTV) system marked the technological apex of Graceland's security evolution. The system, cutting edge for residential use in the mid-1970s, consisted of multiple cameras positioned at strategic points around the property. The main gates, the circular drive, the rear entrance, the pool area, and various positions along the perimeter fence. These cameras fed into a bank of monitors installed in a small room adjacent to the kitchen, where security personnel maintained a constant watch. But the most significant monitors were upstairs. In the master bedroom, a television console was modified to include feeds from the security cameras, allowing Elvis to cycle through views of his property with the push of a button. Estate documents and Memphis Mafia memoirs describe his nocturnal habit of scanning these feeds during his long, sleepless nights, watching the gates where fans gathered, observing the driveway for approaching vehicles, monitoring the empty lawn in the pre-dawn hours. The surveillance system transformed Graceland's acres into an extension of his bedroom, a space he could observe and control without physical presence. The psychological implications of this arrangement are considerable. Elvis, the most watched man in America, had created a house where he could reverse the gaze, where he was the observer, and the world beyond his walls became the spectacle. Yet the cameras could not extend beyond the property line. They could monitor what came through the gates, but not the forces gathering beyond them. The surveillance system offered an illusion of control, a technological buffer that appeared to enhance security, but primarily served to deepen isolation. The architectural manifestation of this security obsession was the complete fortification of the second floor as the forbidden zone. The heavy, upholstered door at the top of the stairs, installed in the mid-1960s, remained the primary physical barrier, but by 1975, the protocols surrounding access to the upstairs had calcified into near ritual. Memphis Mafia members interviewed decades later described the rules with precision. No one went upstairs unless summoned. No one knocked on the door without permission. No one discussed what happened beyond that threshold with outsiders. The door itself, documented in photographs taken during later preservation work, was an object of considerable craftsmanship. Built from solid wood and upholstered in padded leather or vinyl, it was designed to seal acoustically as well as physically. When closed, it muffled sound transmission between the floors, creating an acoustic barrier that complemented the visual privacy. Voices from downstairs arrived upstairs as dim murmurs. Elvis's movements above went largely unheard below. The house, architecturally divided by this single element, existed in two separate sonic worlds. Security personnel, primarily drawn from off-duty Memphis police officers and private security firms, operated according to a strict hierarchy of access and information. Gate guards maintained the perimeter, logged visitors, and handled the daily crowd of fans who gathered outside. Inside the house, Memphis Mafia members served as a second layer, managing guests who had been admitted through the gates but not yet authorized for deeper access. And upstairs, beyond the padded door, only a select few were permitted. Typically, Elvis's physician, his current romantic partner, and the most trusted members of his inner circle. The estate's employee roster from 1975, preserved in payroll records, reveals the infrastructure required to maintain this system. 3 shifts of gate guards, 2 shifts of interior security, a dedicated house manager, and the Memphis Mafia members on permanent staff. The annual cost of this security apparatus, documented in financial statements, ran to hundreds of thousands of dollars, an expense that was growing even as Elvis's income from performances became more erratic. The guards themselves, in interviews conducted years later, described their work with a curious mixture of boredom and vigilance. Long hours watching, monitors that showed mostly empty lawn and dark driveway, punctuated by occasional moments of genuine threat. Aggressive fans attempting to scale the fence, photographers with telephoto lenses hiding in the tree line across Highway 51, the occasional disturbed individual who arrived at the gates claiming to be Elvis's long-lost relative or spiritual twin. The guards managed these incidents with professional efficiency, but the underlying reality was clear. No amount of fencing could fully protect Elvis from the world's obsession with him. Inside the monitored perimeter, the surveillance system created its own strange domesticity. Security cameras captured the mundane traffic of daily life, the cook arriving before dawn to begin breakfast preparations, groundskeepers mowing the lawn, delivery trucks bringing supplies. The footage, recorded on now obsolete reel-to-reel videotape, documented Graceland's routines with bureaucratic thoroughness. Some of these tapes, preserved in the Graceland archives, offer a peculiar window into the estate's final years. Grainy black and white images of an empty driveway at 3 a.m., or a distant figure, Elvis perhaps, visible briefly at an upstairs window before retreating into darkness. The psychological impact of living under constant surveillance extended to everyone on the property. Memphis Mafia members, aware that their movements were being recorded, developed a kind of camera consciousness, a performative awareness that subtly altered behavior. Guests, informed of the security system, moderated their actions accordingly. The house, wired for observation, became a stage where every room was potentially monitored, every conversation potentially overheard through the intercom system. Yet the irony of this elaborate security apparatus was that its primary function was not to keep threats out, but to keep Elvis in. The surveillance system monitored the perimeter, but its true purpose was to create a world so comprehensively controlled that Elvis never needed to leave. Everything he required, food, medication, entertainment, companionship, could be delivered through the gates and up the stairs, eliminating any necessity for him to venture beyond the property line into the uncontrolled chaos of public space. By 1976, this isolation had become nearly absolute. Accounts from this period describe weeks when Elvis never left Graceland, sometimes never left the second floor. His world contracted to the dimensions of the master bedroom and its adjoining bathroom. The surveillance monitors gave him a window on his property, but that window was itself a form of confinement, a technological substitute for actual experience. The estate, designed originally as a pastoral refuge, had evolved into something closer to a maximum security facility, though it was never entirely clear whether Elvis was being protected or imprisoned. The distinction, by this point, had largely collapsed. The gates that kept fans out also kept him in. The cameras that monitored threats also monitored escape routes. The door at the top of the stairs, which preserved his privacy, also sealed his solitude. Outside the walls, Memphis continued its indifferent rhythms. Families drove past on Elvis Presley Boulevard, many slowing to look at the gates, but few fully comprehending what lay beyond them. To the city, Graceland remained a landmark, a tourist curiosity, a place where the king lived in splendor. The surveillance tapes told a different story. A man alone in a large house, watching television monitors that showed an empty lawn, waiting for sleep that would not come naturally, surrounded by security that could not secure what mattered most. The architecture, in its final configuration, had achieved a kind of horrible perfection. It was a machine for isolation, precisely engineered and meticulously maintained. Every camera, every guard, every locked door and monitored fence line served the same purpose: to create a world where Elvis could remain the king, insulated from reality's power to contradict the image. The system worked flawlessly until, in August 1977, it confronted the one threat no surveillance system could monitor or gate could exclude. This chapter approaches the threshold but respects the seal that has been maintained since August 1977. The second floor of Graceland, and particularly the master suite at its front, remains closed to public tours, a decision made by the Presley family and maintained by the Biltmore Company, which manages the estate. What follows is reconstructed from architectural plans, authorized descriptions by household staff and family members, preservation documentation, and the careful inferences available from the historical record. The master bedroom, positioned at the front of the house with windows overlooking the circular drive, measured approximately 18 by 20 feet, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to roughly 12 feet at its apex. The spatial volume was generous by standard residential measures, but the room's proportions were systematically negated by its decoration and use. The walls were painted in deep blues and golds, colors that absorbed rather than reflected light. The vaulted ceiling, which might have created a sense of expansiveness, was rendered irrelevant by the blackout curtains that sealed the windows against daylight. These curtains, custom made from heavy fabric and installed on reinforced rods, were drawn closed as a matter of routine. Accounts from Memphis Mafia members and household staff describe them as perpetually shut during Elvis's occupancy, creating a permanent twilight within the room, regardless of the time of day. The windows, which faced south and would have admitted generous Tennessee sunshine, functioned instead as sealed portals, their glass hidden behind layers of fabric. The room existed in a state of artificial night, its illumination provided entirely by lamps and the glow of television screens. The furniture arrangement centered on a king-sized bed, custom made to accommodate Elvis's 6-foot frame and positioned to face a television mounted on a swivel stand. The bed was typically unmade, according to photographic evidence from the few authorized observers who documented the space. Its covers rumpled, its pillows arranged in configurations meant to support extended periods of semi-reclining television watching. Beside the bed, a nightstand held books, primarily spiritual texts, including works on numerology, theosophy, and Christian mysticism, and a telephone with multiple lines connecting to other parts of the house and to external numbers. The temperature of the room was kept artificially low, maintained by air conditioning units that ran continuously. Elvis, according to numerous accounts, preferred his bedroom cold, meat locker cold, in the phrase used by several Memphis Mafia members. The chill was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it counteracted the Tennessee heat and humidity that he had always despised. Symbolically, it created an environment divorced from the natural world, a climate-controlled capsule that bore no relationship to the weather outside. The bathroom adjacent to the master bedroom had evolved into something more than a utilitarian space. Expanded and remodeled in the early 1960s, it served triple duty as bathroom, dressing room, and pharmacy. Medicine cabinets lined one wall, their shelves accumulating the prescriptions that would eventually number in the dozens. Sleeping pills, stimulants, painkillers, tranquilizers, all prescribed by physicians whose names appear in estate financial records as recipients of substantial consulting fees. The bathroom's mirrors, edge-lit and covering significant wall space, allowed Elvis to examine himself from multiple angles, a necessity for someone whose physical appearance was integral to his professional identity, but also a source of escalating anxiety as age and medication effects altered that appearance. Household staff, who occasionally entered the bathroom to clean, described it as cluttered, its counter surfaces covered with toiletries, hair products, and the accumulated detritus of daily grooming rituals that could occupy hours. An office space, carved from what had originally been a large closet or dressing area, occupied the northeast corner of the suite. Here, a desk held paperwork, contracts, financial statements, letters from fans that Elvis reviewed irregularly. More significantly, the office contained additional bookshelves housing his spiritual library, texts on meditation, reincarnation, Eastern philosophy, and Christian theology. These books, their spines creased from repeated reading, documented Elvis's sustained search for meaning beyond the mechanics of fame. The sensory character of the master suite was defined by isolation from natural rhythms. With the blackout curtains drawn, day and night lost distinction. The room's occupant existed in a timeless present, structured not by the sun's passage, but by the television schedule, the intercom summons, the arrival of meals, and the chemically managed cycles of wakefulness and sleep. The air, filtered and cooled, carried no scent of the outside world. No grass clippings from the lawn, no rain, no seasonal changes. Instead, it smelled of climate control, of carpet and fabric, of the medications whose bottles accumulated in the bathroom. Acoustic isolation was nearly complete. The room sat above the house's main corridor, separated from ground floor activity by the thickness of floor joists, subfloor, and carpet. The heavy door at the top of the stairs muffled sounds from below. The sealed windows blocked traffic noise from Elvis Presley Boulevard. When the television was off and the intercom silent, the room existed in a profound quiet, broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the occasional distant thump of doors closing elsewhere in the house. This was the architecture of retreat carried to its logical terminus, a room designed not merely for sleep, but for permanent withdrawal from the world, where the ground floor spaces of Graceland maintained at least a theoretical connection to social life, spaces where guests could gather, where meals could be served, where performances of normality could be staged. The master bedroom rejected sociability entirely. It was a hermit cell, albeit one furnished with a king-sized bed and color television. The room's psychological function is perhaps best understood as a kind of womb, a space offering the illusion of safety and control in a life increasingly characterized by chaos and collapse. Within these walls, Elvis could control the light, the temperature, the sound. He could summon companions through the intercom and dismiss them with a word. He could watch the surveillance monitors and see his property reduced to manageable images on screens. The room offered omniscience and omnipotence within a carefully bounded domain. But this illusion of control came at a cost. The master bedroom, for all its technological sophistication and customized comfort, was also a trap. Its very perfections, the blackout curtains that created perpetual night, the climate control that eliminated weather, the acoustic isolation that muffled the world, served to deepen the disconnection between Elvis and reality. In seeking to create a space of absolute control, he had constructed a sensory deprivation chamber. The forbidden knowledge aspect of the upstairs suite, the fact that it remains closed to public tours, has contributed to its mythologization. It exists in the public imagination as the epicenter of decline, the room where the carefully curated image of Elvis Presley finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Preservation studies and family accounts confirm the basics. This was where he spent his final years, where the insomnia and medication dependence and spiritual seeking played out, away from cameras, where the king became simply a man struggling with demons that no amount of architectural isolation could exorcise. The room, in its final function, represented the ultimate failure of the isolation system. It had been designed to protect Elvis from the consuming attention of the world, to create a space where he could rest and recover between the performances that defined his public life. Instead, it became the site where the distinction between the performance and the performer finally catastrophically blurred. The architecture that was meant to preserve the man ended up preserving only the image, while the man inside deteriorated in the artificial darkness. In a final burst of construction activity, Elvis commissioned the racquetball building in late 1974, with completion in early 1975. The structure, positioned approximately 150 feet from the main house's rear entrance, represented the estate's last major architectural addition during his lifetime. Designed as a recreational facility, it would instead become the final refuge within the refuge, a space that perfectly encapsulated Graceland's tragic paradox. Rooms dedicated to health and vitality, occupied by a man whose physical condition was visibly, catastrophically failing. The building's exterior was unremarkable, a rectangular structure roughly 40 by 60 feet, clad in siding that matched the main house's aesthetic with minimal ornamentation. but the interior revealed considerable ambition. The racquetball court itself occupied the central space, a regulation-sized playing area with hardwood floors, white walls, and the clean geometry required by the sport. Fluorescent lights, installed in protective cages on the ceiling, illuminated the space with institutional brightness. Viewing windows along one wall allowed spectators to watch games from an adjacent lounge area. This lounge, more than the court itself, became the building's functional heart, decorated in the same dark, enveloping style that characterized Graceland's ground floor renovations. It featured low lighting, plush seating, and wood paneling that absorbed sound and light in equal measure. An upright piano, positioned against one wall, provided a musical instrument more accessible than the grand pianos in the main house's formal rooms. A small kitchen area and bathroom completed the facilities. Estate documents and Memphis Mafia accounts describe the racquetball building's actual use, which deviated significantly from its ostensible purpose. While Elvis occasionally played racquetball during the building's first year, photographs exist showing him on the court, paddle in hand, his jumpsuit-clad figure moving through the geometric space. These sessions were infrequent and brief. Physical exertion had become difficult. By 1976, his cardiovascular condition and medication regimen made sustained athletic activity dangerous. Instead, the building functioned primarily as yet another retreat space, an alternative to the main house when its rooms felt too familiar or too confining. Late-night sessions in the racquetball building lounge became routine, documented in the memoirs of those present. Elvis at the upright piano, working through gospel songs or fragments of new compositions, his voice, still powerful when deployed, still capable of the phrasing and emotional resonance that had defined his artistry, rising into the acoustically dead air of the paneled room. The architectural disconnect between the building's healthy, athletic purpose and the deteriorating physical reality of its primary occupant was stark. The racquetball court, with its clean lines and bright lights, suggested vigor and competition. The lounge, dark and womb-like, invited sedentary hours of television watching and meandering conversation. The piano offered a connection to music, to the artistry that had justified everything else. But even this connection was compromised by Elvis's increasingly erratic schedule and declining health. Recordings made in the racquetball building, primarily casual audio captured by Memphis Mafia members, reveal the space's strange acoustic. The lounge's wood paneling absorbed reverb, creating a dry, intimate sound quality not unlike the carpeted jungle room. Voices and piano notes hung in the air briefly, before vanishing into the absorbent surfaces, giving conversations an eerie immediacy, every word distinct, every silence profound. The building also served as a final architectural experiment in escape, where the main house had become densely layered with memory and routine. Each room freighted with associations, each corner charged with history. The racquetball building offered relative blankness. It was new, unfinished by long occupation, a space where Elvis might imagine starting over, creating new patterns, escaping the accumulated weight of Graceland's other rooms. But escape proved illusory. The Memphis Mafia followed him to the racquetball building, replicating the same dynamics of dependence and enabling that characterized life in the main house. The medications came along, the insomnia, the spiritual searching, the mounting evidence of physiological breakdown. The new space, for all its architectural freshness, could not interrupt the trajectory already well established. By 1977, even the racquetball building had become part of the exhausted circuit of Graceland's internal geography. Elvis would move from the master bedroom to the ground floor television room, to the jungle room, to the racquetball building lounge, seeking in architectural variety some relief from the constancy of his condition. But the relief never came. The building, like every other structure on the property, was still inside the gates, still within the isolation system, still part of the fortress that had long since become a prison. Photographs from the racquetball building's interior, taken during Elvis's occupancy and preserved in the Graceland archives, show a space caught between its intended purpose and its actual function. The racquetball court, pristine and unused, glows in fluorescent brightness. The lounge, dim and heavily occupied, shows the wear of constant use. Cushions depressed by bodies, ashtrays full, water rings on tables. The piano, an instrument meant for joy, sits silent in shadows. The last songs recorded at Graceland, including sessions in both the Jungle Room and the racquetball building in October 1976, captured Elvis's voice in these compressed, airless spaces. The recordings, released posthumously, carry the sonic signature of their architectural context. Close, intimate, stripped of the reverb and spatial depth that had characterized his earlier work. They sound like music made in a bunker, which, in a sense, they were. The racquetball building stands now as part of the Graceland tour, its court preserved behind plexiglass, its lounge maintained as a museum exhibit. Visitors can look through windows at the piano, where Elvis played his final compositions, can see the lounge where he spent his final late-night sessions. The building, in its museumification, has become a relic of a failed escape, architectural evidence that no amount of new construction could outrun the forces already consuming its builder. The morning of August 16th, 1977, began in the master bedroom's artificial darkness, behind the blackout curtains that had sealed the windows for so many years. The exact chronology of that day, reconstructed from medical examiner reports, police statements, and eyewitness accounts, reveals not a sudden catastrophe, but the final movement of a long, slow collapse, a process in which the architecture of Graceland played an unexpected and tragic role. Elvis, according to the timeline established by investigators, had been awake through the night of August 15, 16, following his habitual nocturnal schedule. In the early morning hours, he received dental work from his dentist, who made a house call around 2:30 a.m., a detail that speaks to the complete inversion of normal time that governed life at Graceland. After the dental appointment, Elvis retired to his bedroom, intending to sleep before a scheduled evening flight to Portland, Maine, for a concert tour. What happened in the hours that followed remains partially obscured by privacy and the limitations of forensic reconstruction. What is known, established by medical testimony and estate records, is that at approximately 2 p.m. on August 16th, Ginger Alden, Elvis's girlfriend, who had been sleeping in the master bedroom, awoke to find him missing. She discovered him in the adjacent bathroom, unconscious and unresponsive, his body positioned near the toilet, facing downward. Alden's call for help triggered a cascade of emergency response, and here, the architecture of Graceland inserted itself into the tragedy with cruel irony. The paramedics, summoned through the 911 system and arriving at the gates within minutes, faced the same barriers that had protected Elvis from unwanted intrusion. The locked gates required precious seconds to open. The long drive from the street to the house consumed more time. The entrance through the front door and the navigation to the staircase added further delay. But the staircase itself, that elegant spiral of limestone and oak that had served as the architectural boundary between public and private, between image and reality, now became an obstacle to salvation. The stairs, while grand in their proportions, were relatively narrow by emergency access standards. The turn at the landing, where the privacy wall partially blocked sightlines, created a tight angle. The padded door at the top, designed to preserve acoustic and visual isolation, was another barrier requiring navigation. Paramedics, their efforts documented in the Emergency Services Report filed with Shelby County, had to maneuver resuscitation equipment up those stairs, through that door, into the master bedroom, and then into the bathroom where Elvis lay. Each second consumed in this architectural navigation was a second lost to potential life-saving intervention. The house, built to protect him from the world, now hindered the world's attempt to save him. The resuscitation efforts, conducted first in the bathroom and then, after moving Elvis's body, in the bedroom itself, proved unsuccessful. He was transported to Baptist Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m. The official cause, listed on the death certificate after autopsy and toxicological analysis, was cardiac arrhythmia, though the contributing factors, including the polypharmacy documented in his system and his significantly compromised health, painted a more complex picture. Back at Graceland, as word spread through the Memphis Mafia and household staff, the estate entered a strange twilight. For the first time in 2 decades, the master bedroom stood empty, its blackout curtains still drawn, its television silent, its air conditioning still running in the perpetual chill that Elvis had preferred. The bathroom, scene of the collapse, was cordoned off by investigators gathering evidence. The house that had been designed as a machine for isolation now contained the ultimate silence. Within hours, news of Elvis's death reached the public. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fans began gathering at the gates of Graceland almost instantly, drawn by radio and television bulletins, arriving in steadily increasing numbers through the afternoon and evening. By nightfall of August 16th, thousands pressed against the musical note gates, the iron bars bending under the unintended load of grief. The scene at the gates, documented in news footage and photographs archived by Memphis media, showed the isolation system under siege from a new direction. Where the architecture had been designed to keep crowds out, it now struggled to manage crowds that had nowhere else to direct their mourning. The gates became a spontaneous shrine, covered within hours by flowers, handwritten notes, photographs, teddy bears, and other tokens of grief. The limestone walls were lined with candles. Elvis Presley Boulevard, normally busy with commercial traffic, became a slow-moving river of pilgrimage. Inside the walls, Vernon Presley and the remaining family members faced a logistical and emotional crisis. The house that had served as a fortress now felt like a trap, its occupants surrounded by an ocean of grief they could hear but not fully see. The surveillance cameras showed crowds pressing against the fence line, but the screens offered no way to measure the depth of emotion those crowds represented. The decision was made to bring Elvis's body back to Graceland for a public viewing. On August 17th, his copper casket was positioned in the foyer just inside the front door, in the same entrance hall where Christmas trees had stood and where guests had been received. The gates were opened in controlled intervals, allowing mourners to file past the casket in a procession that lasted through the day and into the night. Graceland, built to exclude the public, now admitted them, but only along a carefully controlled path. Mourners entered through the gates, walked up the drive, passed through the front door into the foyer, viewed the casket, and exited through a side door. They saw only this single corridor of the house, a narrow slice of the estate's interior. The rest, the upstairs, the jungle room, the private spaces, remained sealed. Photographs from that day, archived in Memphis libraries and newspaper collections, show the juxtaposition. Elvis's body laid out in formal repose, dressed in a white suit, surrounded by thousands of flowers, while outside the windows, visible through the glass, the crowds stretched to the horizon. The house, for a brief moment, became what it had never been during Elvis's life, a truly public space, where the boundary between the icon and the people who had created that icon temporarily dissolved. The flowers, brought by mourners and delivered by florists, filled every available surface on the ground floor. Their scent, roses, lilies, carnations, the heavy sweetness of funeral arrangements, overwhelmed the house's usual climate-controlled neutrality. The limestone entrance hall, designed for elegance and restraint, became a greenhouse of grief, botanical evidence of the scale of loss. On August 18th, a private funeral service was held at Graceland, attended by family and close friends. The service was brief, marked by gospel music and scripture readings, conducted in the same music room where Elvis had once played his piano and listened to Mahalia Jackson records. From there, a funeral procession wound through Memphis to Forest Hill Cemetery, where Elvis was initially interred in a mausoleum beside his mother, Gladys. But the story did not end with burial. Within weeks, security concerns at the public cemetery, including a thwarted attempt to steal Elvis's body for ransom, forced a grim decision. On October 2nd, 1977, both Elvis and Gladys's remains were exhumed and reinterred at Graceland in the meditation garden that Elvis had constructed in the mid-1960s as a place of quiet reflection. This final architectural modification was necessitated by the same forces that had driven Graceland's evolution from the beginning: the need to protect Elvis from the world's obsession with him. Even in death, he could not rest in a public cemetery without becoming a target. The meditation garden, a small courtyard behind the pool area, flanked by limestone walls and accessible only through the estate's controlled gates, became his permanent resting place. The graves, Elvis's, Gladys's, Vernon's, who would die in 1979, and grandmother Minnie Mae's, were marked with bronze plaques and surrounded by an eternal flame. The meditation garden, originally a space for contemplation, became the estate's sacred center, the point toward which the entire property now oriented. Graceland, in losing its occupant, had gained a new identity. It was no longer the home of a living king, but the tomb of a dead one. A transition that would, within 5 years, fundamentally reshape its purpose and ensure its physical survival. In the days immediately following Elvis's death and funeral, Graceland entered a period of suspended animation. The house, still containing all of Elvis's possessions exactly as he had left them, existed in a kind of museumified present tense. The blackout curtains remained drawn in the master bedroom. The television sets throughout the house were turned off. The jungle room's shag carpet and tiki furniture sat untouched. The racquetball building stood empty. The entire estate, which had been organized around the rhythms of one man's erratic schedule, now had no schedule at all. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father an executor of his estate, occupied the house as a shell-shocked survivor. Financial documents from this period, preserved in the estate's business archives, reveal the economic reality that Vernon confronted. Graceland consumed approximately $500,000 annually in maintenance, property taxes, security, and basic operations. But Elvis's estate, while substantial, was not infinite. The fortune had been eroded by years of generous spending, large entourage salaries, and Elvis's habit of buying Cadillacs and houses for friends and strangers alike. Moreover, the bulk of Elvis's wealth was tied up in future royalty streams that would take time to materialize fully. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the estate faced a liquidity crisis. Graceland, rather than being an asset, was a massive liability, a money-consuming property whose value was sentimental rather than financial. The siege of grief at the gates, which had peaked during the funeral, did not subside, but instead settled into a permanent condition. Fans continued to visit daily, pressing against the iron bars, taking photographs, leaving flowers and messages. What had been a spontaneous outpouring of mourning calcified into pilgrimage, a daily ritual that showed no signs of ending. The estate's security costs escalated as guards struggled to manage the crowds and protect the property from trespassers and vandals. By late 1977, Vernon and his advisors, including Elvis's ex-wife Priscilla Presley, faced a stark choice. Maintain Graceland as a private mausoleum, slowly bleeding the estate's resources until selling became inevitable. Or find a way to make the property financially sustainable. The model they considered was Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate, which had been opened to public tours and successfully operated as a historic site since the 19th century. But Vernon, still grieving and increasingly unwell himself, resisted this path. The idea of allowing strangers to walk through his son's home, to gawk at the rooms where Elvis had lived and died, felt like a final violation of the privacy that Graceland had been built to protect. Through 1978 and into 1979, the estate remained closed, its finances deteriorating, its future uncertain. Vernon Presley died on June 26, 1979, leaving the estate in the hands of executors and trustees, with Elvis's daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, as the primary heir. Lisa Marie, only 11 years old at Vernon's death, could not take control for years. The estate's management fell to a court-appointed team, with Priscilla Presley emerging as a forceful advocate for aggressive action to preserve Graceland and stabilize the estate's finances. Priscilla, who had divorced Elvis in 1973 but maintained a relationship of complicated loyalty, understood that sentiment alone would not save Graceland. She worked with the executors and business consultants to develop a plan that would be anathema to Vernon, but essential for survival, opening the mansion to paying visitors, transforming Elvis's private fortress into America's most famous house museum. The decision was announced in late 1981. Graceland would open for public tours on June 7, 1982, the first day of what was projected to be an experimental summer season. If successful, the tours would continue indefinitely. If they failed to generate sufficient revenue, the property would likely be sold, the contents auctioned, the house itself potentially demolished for redevelopment. The months leading up to the opening required extensive preparation, documented in planning documents and contractor records. The house, while structurally sound, had been designed for private occupation, not public traffic. Every surface, floors, carpets, furniture, needed protection from the wear of thousands of feet. The logistics of moving visitors through the spaces while preserving their integrity required careful planning. Insurance companies, consulted about coverage for a house museum of this nature, raised concerns about capacity limits, fire safety, and the value of the irreplaceable contents. Preservation consultants, brought in to assess the house's condition, identified areas of concern. The shag carpets, while iconic, were difficult to clean and would deteriorate under heavy traffic. The mirrored surfaces were vulnerable to fingerprints and scratches. The jungle room's waterfall would require constant maintenance. The solution was a carefully controlled tour path. Visitors would enter through the front door, proceed through the ground floor public rooms, living room, music room, dining room, kitchen, television room, jungle room, and then exit to the outdoor spaces, the pool area, the meditation garden with Elvis's grave, the museum buildings that would house his cars and costumes. The upstairs would remain closed, off limits to tours, its contents preserved behind the padded door exactly as they had been on August 16, 1977. This decision, to seal the upstairs and preserve it as a kind of time capsule, was both practical and symbolic. Practically, opening the upstairs would have required extensive modifications to handle visitor traffic and would have exposed the most private spaces to public consumption. Symbolically, keeping the upstairs closed preserved the mystery, the sense of boundary between public icon and private human that had always defined Graceland. Physical modifications to accommodate tourists included the installation of carpet runners over the original floor coverings, protecting them from wear while allowing visitors to see the room's decor. Velvet ropes and plexiglass barriers were positioned to keep visitors at safe distances from furniture and artifacts. Lighting was adjusted to be bright enough for viewing, but dim enough to prevent UV damage to fabrics and finishes. Climate control was upgraded to handle the moisture and temperature fluctuations introduced by large numbers of people moving through confined spaces. The tour route was designed to be self-guided, with visitors receiving audio devices that would narrate the experience as they moved through the house. This decision, influenced by the success of similar systems at other museums, allowed Graceland to handle large visitor volumes without requiring armies of docents. It also controlled the narrative, ensuring that visitors heard an approved version of Elvis's story rather than the potentially chaotic oral histories that live guides might deliver. Marketing for the opening emphasized both reverence and access. See where the king lived. Promotional materials, preserved in the Graceland archives, positioned the tours as a kind of secular pilgrimage, an opportunity to walk in Elvis's footsteps, to experience the spaces he had inhabited. Early advertisements ran in Memphis newspapers and regional publications, targeting both local curiosity and the steady stream of Elvis fans who had been coming to the gates since 1977. The economic projections were modest. Consultants estimated that Graceland might attract 200,000 to 300,000 visitors annually if successful, generating enough revenue to cover operating costs and perhaps provide a modest return to the estate. No one predicted what would actually happen. On June 7, 1982, when Graceland's gates officially opened to paying visitors for the first time, the line stretched down Elvis Presley Boulevard. By the end of the first day, over 3,000 people had toured the mansion. By the end of the first week, it was clear that the projections had been wildly conservative. Graceland would not merely survive as a tourist attraction, it would become one of the most visited private homes in America, second only to the White House in annual visitors. The house that Elvis had built to escape the public had been saved by admitting them. The isolation system had been inverted. Where guards had once kept crowds out, they now managed crowds streaming in. Where the architecture had been designed to create distance between Elvis and the world, it now closed that distance, allowing strangers to stand in his living room, to see the jungle room's shag carpet in person, to walk past the graves in the meditation garden. Graceland had disappeared as a private home. That entity had ceased to exist on August 16, 1977. But it had been reborn as something else: a shrine, a museum, a business, and a cultural landmark. The transformation ensured its physical survival, but permanently altered its meaning. The house was no longer a place where someone lived. It was a place where someone had lived, past tense, and that past was now packaged, narrated, and sold to anyone willing to pay admission. From the opening of public tours in 1982 through the present day, Graceland has existed in a state of careful suspended animation, a house maintained in perpetual 1977, its rooms frozen at the moment of Elvis's death, its decor preserved as evidence of his taste, his era, and his isolation. This preservation has required not just financial resources, but constant architectural intervention, a fact that visitors rarely perceive as they move through rooms that appear simply to exist, unchanging and eternal. The scale of Graceland's success as a tourist attraction exceeded every projection. Within the first year of operation, over 500,000 visitors toured the mansion, generating revenue sufficient not only to cover operational costs, but to fund expansions and improvements. By the late 1980s, annual visitation regularly exceeded 600,000. In the decades since, Graceland has attracted well over 20 million visitors, making it one of the most visited historic house museums in the world. This commercial success enabled the Biltmore Company, restructured and renamed Elvis Presley Enterprises in later iterations, to expand the property's tourism infrastructure far beyond the mansion itself. Across Elvis Presley Boulevard, on land purchased in the 1980s and 1990s, a complex of museums, gift shops, restaurants, and hotels arose. These facilities house Elvis's car collection, his costumes and gold records, his private planes, the Lisa Marie and Hound Dog de Song, both moved to the property, and an ever-expanding archive of memorabilia. But at the center of this commercial empire, the mansion itself remains architecturally inviolate. The rooms that visitors see today, the living room with its white sofas and glass coffee table, the dining room with its gold lame curtains, the jungle room with its green shag carpet and tiki furniture, the television room with its 3 sets and mirrored ceiling, are maintained exactly as they appeared in the 1970s. When carpets wear, they are repaired or replaced with identical materials. When fabrics fade, they are restored or reproduced. When the waterfall in the jungle room requires maintenance, technicians service it invisibly, ensuring that visitors see only the finished effect. This commitment to preservation through replication creates a curious temporal loop. Graceland in 2024 looks remarkably like Graceland in 1977, but this similarity is achieved through constant labor. The house is not actually unchanged. It is perpetually reconstructed, a living museum that performs timelessness through meticulous maintenance. Preservation documents, held in the estate's archives, detail the ongoing interventions. Climate control systems upgraded to better protect fabrics from humidity. Lighting systems modernized while maintaining period-appropriate fixtures. Structural reinforcements to support floor loads far exceeding residential norms. Fire suppression systems installed discreetly behind walls and ceilings. The decision to keep the upstairs sealed has proven both commercially and culturally astute. By maintaining the second floor as forbidden space, Graceland preserves a zone of mystery that no amount of tourism can diminish. Visitors, standing at the base of the staircase and looking up toward the padded door, experience a controlled sense of exclusion. They can see the beginning of the stairs, but not what lies beyond. This architectural barrier generates narrative speculation and psychological investment in ways that complete access never could. The meditation garden, where Elvis and 3 generations of Presleys are buried, has become the emotional and spiritual center of the estate. The graves, marked with bronze plaques set into marble slabs, are surrounded by an eternal flame that burns continuously. The garden's limestone walls create an enclosed courtyard, a space of enforced quiet in the middle of a tourism complex. Visitors file through in a steady stream, pausing at the graves, leaving flowers and notes, taking photographs, engaging in private moments of grief or connection despite the presence of hundreds of other tourists. The annual candlelight vigil, begun spontaneously by fans in the years after Elvis's death and formalized by the estate in the 1990s, has become Graceland's most sacred ritual. Each year, on the evening of August 15th, fans gather at the gates holding candles. At dark, the gates open, and the crowd files up the driveway and through the meditation garden in a procession that can last for hours. The driveway, lined with thousands of candles, becomes a river of flame, a temporary transformation that echoes the night of Elvis's funeral, but inverts its meaning, turning private grief into collective memory. The business model pioneered by Graceland, transforming a celebrity home into a tourist-driven revenue generator, has been replicated with varying success at other sites. But few have achieved Graceland's strange alchemy. The house remains unmistakably a house, not a museum wearing a house's facade. The shag carpets, the mirrored ceilings, the jungle room's aggressive kitsch. These are not museum pieces ironically displayed, but sincere artifacts of Elvis's actual taste, preserved without apology or contextualization. This preservation strategy has generated ongoing cultural debates. To some critics, particularly those who view the Gilded Age mansions of Newport or the classical estates of Virginia as proper house museums, Graceland represents a lowering of curatorial standards, a celebration of tacky excess that should be critiqued rather than preserved. To others, Graceland's authenticity, its refusal to smooth Elvis's aesthetic choices into something more culturally palatable, makes it more honest than estates that have been editorially refined over decades of curatorial intervention. Academic researchers studying Graceland's cultural significance have noted its role as a shrine in the secular religion of celebrity worship. Pilgrims and visitors to Graceland often use that term self-consciously, come seeking connection to Elvis not as a historical figure, but as an ongoing presence. The house, in this reading, functions less as an archive of the past than as a portal to a personality that visitors feel they know intimately despite never having met him. The economic impact of Graceland on Memphis and Shelby County has been substantial and well documented in regional economic studies. The estate and its associated tourism infrastructure generate hundreds of millions of dollars in annual economic activity, supporting thousands of jobs directly and indirectly. Graceland has become one of Memphis's defining landmarks, rivaling Beale Street and the National Civil Rights Museum as a driver of tourism. The city's identity, for better or worse, is intertwined with Elvis's legacy, and Graceland is the physical manifestation of that connection. In 2016, Graceland received additional recognition when the main house, the meditation garden, and 13 acres of the estate were designated a National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service. The designation, documented in official nomination forms, cited Graceland's significance in American cultural history, its association with Elvis's life and career, and its architectural representation of post-war American taste and celebrity culture. The landmark designation brought formal recognition but changed little about Graceland's day-to-day operation. The house had long been managed with preservation in mind, and the estate's owners saw the designation primarily as validation of their stewardship, rather than a call for operational changes. But the recognition underscored Graceland's evolution from private home to cultural institution, a transition completed not through architectural modification, but through shifts in context and meaning. Recent years have seen new additions to the Graceland campus, while the mansion itself remains frozen in time. In 2017, a new $45 million entertainment complex opened across the street, featuring expanded exhibit spaces, restaurants, and event venues. These additions, designed in contemporary architectural styles rather than period pastiche, create a deliberate contrast with the 1977 preserved mansion. The complex serves to contain the commercial aspects of Graceland's operations, keeping the mansion itself focused on its primary function, serving as the carefully maintained stage set for Elvis's final act. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020-2021 forced Graceland to close temporarily for the first time since opening in 1982, an unplanned experiment in what the house might be without visitors. Staff who worked through the closure described an eerie quality to the empty mansion, its rooms silent except for the hum of climate control systems, its carpets unmarked by foot traffic. The house, built to isolate its occupant from the public, briefly returned to isolation, though its occupant was long gone. When Graceland reopened with safety protocols, visitors returned immediately, suggesting that the pandemic had not diminished the estate's draw. If anything, the temporary inaccessibility intensified the desire to visit, to walk through the spaces that had been sealed off, to complete the pilgrimage that had been interrupted. Looking at Graceland from the perspective of architectural history, the estate represents a peculiar species of survival. Unlike the Gilded Age mansions of Newport, many of which were demolished or repurposed because their scale and maintenance costs became untenable, Graceland endures because it successfully transformed into a business. Unlike Mount Vernon or Monticello, preserved as national patrimony and operated by foundations, Graceland remains privately owned and profit-driven. It has achieved a hybrid status, commercially operated but culturally revered, a business that trades on sanctity, a shrine that sells tickets. The house's architectural significance is debatable in traditional terms. Richard Morris Hunt never drew an elevation of Graceland. No significant architectural innovations occurred within its walls. The Moore's 1939 neoclassical design was competent but not groundbreaking. Elvis's 1970s renovations, while culturally revealing, were not architecturally influential. Graceland's importance lies not in its design, but in its preservation of a specific historical moment, the apotheosis and isolation of a cultural icon, expressed through shag carpet and mirrored ceilings. Yet this preservation has value precisely because it resists conventional curatorial refinement. Graceland does not present an idealized version of Elvis's life, edited for cultural respectability. It shows the jungle room in all its green shag glory, the television room with its trio of sets, the automobile collection with its gold-plated Cadillacs. The estate preserves not just a house, but a sensibility, a glimpse into how someone with unlimited resources and conflicted instincts about taste chose to live. The upstairs, remaining sealed, has become Graceland's most powerful architectural statement. By refusing access, by maintaining that boundary established by the padded door in the 1960s, the estate ensures that Elvis retains some privacy, even in death. The second floor exists in photographs and descriptions, but it has not been reduced to just another tour stop. It remains what it was intended to be: private space, forever beyond the public gaze. From the gates of Graceland, on any given day, one can observe a phenomenon that would have been recognizable to Elvis in his lifetime: the perpetual crowd. They arrive by tour, bus, and rental car. Families from Nebraska and retirees from Florida. International visitors from Japan and Brazil and Germany. Elvis impersonators in full regalia. And solitary pilgrims who speak to the king as though he might answer. They press phones against the iron bars, photographing the house visible up the drive, its limestone facade and white columns exactly as they appeared in 1957, in 1977, and today. The estate's marketing has long emphasized the superlatives. America's most visited home, with the asterisk noting that the White House, technically a government building, doesn't count. Second most visited house in America, and the registered trademark Gracelander, which transforms a place name into a brand. These phrases appear on brochures, websites, and the audio tour devices distributed to visitors, ensuring that the commercial framework is never far from consciousness. The tours themselves follow a carefully choreographed progression designed to build emotional and narrative momentum. Visitors enter through the front door, crossing the same threshold Elvis crossed, and immediately encounter the living room, with its white furniture and glass surfaces appearing remarkably pristine given the millions who have passed through. The audio tour, narrated by Elvis's daughter, Lisa Marie, and featuring comments from Priscilla Presley, guides visitors through the rooms, providing anecdotes and context while carefully controlling the narrative arc. The dining room, with its gold lame curtains and mirrored accents, presents the 1970s aesthetic at its most concentrated. Visitors pause here, cameras raised, while the audio tour explains Elvis's preference for intimate family dinners, despite the room's formal proportions. The kitchen, functional and surprisingly modest, reminds visitors that beneath the opulence, Graceland was a house where people cooked and ate. The basement spaces, the television room with its 3 sets and mirrored ceiling, the billiard room with its tufted furniture and yards of fabric-covered walls, descend into increasingly compressed environments, spaces that feel more like caves than rooms. And then, the jungle room. Visitors emerge from the narrow basement stairs into the green shag wonderland, and the reaction is nearly universal. Laughter, bewilderment, delight. The sheer audacity of the space breaking through whatever reverential restraint they had maintained. The jungle room, perhaps more than any other space at Graceland, captures Elvis's persona. Excessive, eccentric, unapologetic, simultaneously ridiculous, and somehow magnificent. From the house, the tour moves outside, through the grounds to the pool area, and then to the meditation garden. The shift in tone is dramatic. The playful engagement with the jungle room's kitsch gives way to solemnity as visitors approach the graves. The garden, with its limestone walls and eternal flame, enforces quiet. Even large groups fall silent as they file past the bronze plaques marking Elvis, Gladys, Vernon, and Minnie May. Flowers are everywhere, left by previous visitors, fresh and wilting in layers, evidence of the daily rituals of remembrance. The tour concludes across Elvis Presley Boulevard in the museum complex, where visitors encounter the artifacts of Elvis's career. The gold-plated cars, the jumpsuits encrusted with rhinestones, the gold records lining walls, the personal items salvaged from various periods of his life. A section devoted to his Army service, another to his movie career, another to the Las Vegas years. Each attempts to contextualize and celebrate a different facet of the mythology. But for many visitors, the museum exhibits feel anticlimactic after the house itself. The cars are impressive, the costumes are beautiful, the memorabilia is extensive, but they lack the uncanny intimacy of standing in Elvis's living room, of seeing the jungle room's green shag carpet in person, of knowing that the bed upstairs, though invisible, is still there, made as it was on August 16th, 1977. The seasonal programming at Graceland, particularly the Christmas celebrations, has become central to the estate's cultural significance. Beginning in late November and extending through early January, Graceland is transformed by holiday decorations that deliberately echo the estate's first Christmas in 1957 and its subsequent Christmases through Elvis's lifetime. The house's exterior is outlined in lights. The driveway is lined with luminaries. Inside, the ground floor rooms receive Christmas trees and seasonal decorations, all placed carefully to avoid damaging the preserved interiors. The Graceland Christmas season generates substantial revenue with special holiday tours commanding premium prices. But it also serves a deeper function. It animates the house, bringing life to spaces that can otherwise feel museum dead. The decorations, the seasonal music playing through speakers, the festive atmosphere, these elements temporarily breach the temporal seal, allowing visitors to imagine Graceland as it might have been during Elvis's lifetime, alive and celebratory rather than embalmed in memory. Yet this seasonal ritual also highlights the essential contradiction of Graceland's preservation. The house is maintained to look lived in, but no one lives there. The Christmas decorations stage a fantasy of domestic vitality in rooms that have been empty for nearly 50 years. The illusion is powerful and profitable, but it remains an illusion, sustained by the deliberate maintenance of surfaces and the strategic deployment of nostalgia. The mythologizing function of Graceland's tours and marketing materials cannot be overlooked. The estate presents a carefully edited version of Elvis's life, one that emphasizes his generosity, his love of family, his spiritual seeking, and his artistic genius, while minimizing or omitting his more troubling aspects. The prescription drug dependence, the isolation-enabled excesses, the racial complexities of his appropriation of Black musical traditions, the underage relationships documented in biographical sources. This editorial restraint is commercially necessary. Few would pay to tour a shrine to dysfunction, but it creates a disconnect between the sanitized narrative and the architectural evidence. The blacked out windows, the proliferation of televisions, the isolation system's elaborate security protocols, the jungle room's retreat into fantasy, the padded door sealing off the upstairs. These features speak, for anyone willing to read them, of a man suffocating inside his own fortress. The architecture tells a darker story than the audio tour acknowledges. Academic researchers and cultural critics have increasingly examined Graceland as a text that can be read for insights into celebrity, isolation, American taste, and the construction of posthumous legacy. Scholarly articles analyze the estate's role in shaping Elvis's memory, its function as a site of working-class pilgrimage, and its preservation of a specific aesthetic moment that high culture dismisses but popular culture embraces. These analyses, appearing in journals of American studies, cultural geography, and preservation theory, treat Graceland seriously as both artifact and ongoing performance. The estate's management has shown periodic willingness to engage with more complex narratives. In recent years, exhibit materials have begun to acknowledge Elvis's debts to black musicians and the complex racial dynamics of 1950s Memphis. A permanent exhibit titled Elvis, the Entertainer Career Museum addresses his appropriation of R&B and gospel, though in language that emphasizes admiration and synthesis rather than exploitation. These gestures toward complexity remain tentative, hedged by the commercial imperative to maintain Elvis's heroic status. What visitors to Graceland rarely see, because it's not part of the tour, is the infrastructure required to sustain the illusion. Behind the scenes, Graceland operates as a sophisticated business employing hundreds of people: tour guides, security personnel, maintenance workers, groundskeepers, conservators, retail staff, event planners, and corporate managers. The house that appears to simply exist, unchanged and eternal, is in fact the product of constant labor and significant capital investment. Preservation reports, filed periodically with the National Historic Landmark Program, document the ongoing challenges. HVAC systems stressed by Tennessee's climate extremes and the heat load from visitors. Carpets and fabrics deteriorating despite protection. Structural concerns about floor joists, bearing loads far beyond residential norms. Drainage issues in the meditation garden affecting the grave's foundations. Each problem requires intervention. Each intervention carefully calibrated to preserve authenticity while ensuring the house can continue operating as a tourism venue. The paradox at Graceland's heart is ultimately irresolvable. The house survives because it's been open to the public, but opening it to the public has fundamentally altered what it is. The intimate spaces where Elvis lived in isolation now host thousands of strangers daily. The fortress built to keep the world out has become a gateway admitting the world in. The house designed for privacy has become one of the most public spaces in America. Yet in this transformation, something valuable has been preserved. Graceland stands as evidence that Elvis was real, that the phenomenon had a physical center, that the icon was once a man who lived in a house with shag carpets and mirrored ceilings. In an era where celebrity often feels entirely mediated and virtual, Graceland offers materiality, actual rooms with actual furniture, a gravity and presence that photographs and recordings cannot fully convey. The estate, in its current form, serves multiple constituencies with sometimes conflicting agendas. For Elvis fans, it's a shrine requiring pilgrimage. For the Presley family and estate, it's a business asset generating substantial revenue. For Memphis, it's an economic engine and cultural landmark. For architectural historians, it's a time capsule of 1970s design. For cultural critics, it's a text revealing broader truths about American celebrity and excess. Graceland accommodates all these interpretations simultaneously, its meaning as layered and complex as the house itself. As Graceland approaches 50 years since Elvis's death, the question of its long-term future remains open. The current model, frozen in perpetual 1977, cannot continue indefinitely. Materials age despite preservation efforts. Visitor expectations evolve. Eventually, the house will require more significant interventions than subtle repairs and faithful reproductions. At some point, the decision will need to be made. When does preservation become reconstruction? When does the ship of Theseus, its original planks gradually replaced, stop being the ship? For now, Graceland endures, sustained by ticket sales and reverence, by business acumen and genuine affection, by the conviction, shared by millions of visitors, that the house matters, that Elvis matters, that preserving the spaces where the king lived and died serves some essential function in American cultural memory. The upstairs remains sealed, the padded door closed, the master bedroom and bathroom preserved behind that boundary. This may be Graceland's most significant preservation decision. Recognizing that some spaces should remain private, that even in death, even transformed into a business, even open to millions of strangers, Elvis deserves to keep some part of himself closed off, unknowable, his own. The view from the base of the grand staircase at Graceland, looking upward toward the second floor, frames the estate's central paradox in architectural terms. The stairs rise in their gentle curve, limestone treads and oak balustrade preserved in the same condition they held in 1957, when Elvis first climbed them. The landing, where the privacy wall partially blocks sight lines, marks the boundary of the permitted tour. And at the top, barely visible in the controlled lighting, the padded door stands closed, as it has for nearly 50 years of public tours. This staircase, which during Elvis's lifetime served as the primary architectural mechanism for separating public from private, image from reality, performance from person, has become in death the physical manifestation of a question that Graceland both poses and refuses to answer. What lies beyond the closed door? The literal answer is documented in estate records, preservation reports, and authorized descriptions. A master bedroom with blue walls and blackout curtains, a bathroom where the final medical emergency occurred, several guest rooms, hallways, closets, and storage spaces, all frozen as they were on August 16, 1977. But the closed door's significance transcends its literal contents. It has become a symbolic barrier, the last defense of privacy, in a house otherwise surrendered to total exposure. Visitors standing at that staircase landing, their progress halted by velvet ropes, and the audio tour's carefully scripted narrative, experience a moment of architectural exclusion rare in American tourist culture. They have been admitted through multiple barriers, the gates, the front door, the ground floor rooms, only to encounter this final refusal. The house says, this far and no farther. Beyond this point, even in death, Elvis remains private. The decision to keep the upstairs closed was not foreordained. When Graceland opened for tours in 1982, the executors and managers could have opened the entire house, generating additional visitor interest and potentially higher revenues. The choice to seal the second floor was deliberate, made in recognition that some boundary needed to remain, that the complete commodification of Elvis's private spaces would constitute a final violation. This restraint has proven commercially astute as well as ethically defensible. The closed upstairs generates speculation, mystery, and psychological investment that complete access might have dissipated. Visitor surveys and online forums reveal consistent fascination with what lies beyond the padded door, with theories and reconstructions based on fragments of authorized information. The sealed space has become Graceland's most powerful attraction precisely because it cannot be toured. The architectural lesson of Graceland, if such a peculiar estate can be said to offer lessons, concerns the relationship between space and identity. Elvis built Graceland as an expression of success and a mechanism for control. He renovated it repeatedly, each modification revealing something about his evolving psychological state and his increasingly desperate need for isolation. The house, in its final form, was both palace and prison, sanctuary and trap. After his death, the house could have been sold, demolished, redeveloped. The land alone, positioned on a major Memphis thoroughfare, had significant commercial value. That Graceland survived was not architecturally inevitable, but economically contingent. It survived because the estate found a business model that made preservation profitable. This is a different kind of survival than that achieved by Mount Vernon or Monticello, preserved as national patrimony. Graceland was saved by capitalism, not patriotism. Yet capitalism alone does not explain the house's cultural power. Graceland resonates because it represents, in physical form, a particularly American narrative: the isolated celebrity, the person whose success builds walls as surely as it builds houses, the individual whose privacy must be sacrificed to maintain the image that generates the income that requires the fortress that deepens the isolation. The architecture expresses this circular trap with almost didactic clarity. The house also serves as an accidental monument to the 1970s, an era now sufficiently distant to be viewed with nostalgia rather than disdain. The jungle room's green shag carpet, the television room's mirrored ceiling, the dining room's gold lame curtains. These design choices, which might have been stripped out or updated if Graceland had remained a private residence, have instead been preserved as period documents. Future historians studying American domestic taste in the 1970s will find at Graceland a remarkably complete and unedited example. The meditation garden, where Elvis and his family are interred, represents the estate's final architectural transformation, from house to mausoleum. The decision to bury Elvis at Graceland, driven by security concerns, but resulting in permanent commitment, ensured that the house could never be sold or repurposed without disturbing his grave, an act unlikely to be politically or culturally feasible. The garden, in effect, locked Graceland into its current function in perpetuity. This permanence through burial echoes strategies used by European aristocracy, whose family chapels and crypts anchored estates across generations. Elvis, lacking aristocratic lineage, but possessing aristocratic scale wealth and fame, achieved through death what he had pursued in life: a territory permanently marked as his own, land that could not be taken because it contained his body. The comparison between Graceland and the Gilded Age estates documented elsewhere in this series, the Vanderbilt mansions, the Astor properties, the palatial homes of New York's upper crust, reveals both parallels and distinctions. Like those estates, Graceland was built by new money seeking legitimacy and permanence. Like them, it required enormous resources to construct and maintain. Like many of them, it faced financial challenges when the fortune that sustained it contracted. Unlike most of those estates, however, Graceland survived not through patrician preservation efforts or public acquisition, but through its transformation into a middle-class tourist destination. The Breakers in Newport requires substantial admission fees and targets affluent, culturally sophisticated visitors. Graceland courts the masses, offering premium tours, but also basic admission packages accessible to working-class families. This democratic accessibility, while perhaps lowering its prestige in elite cultural circles, has ensured its financial viability and broad cultural relevance. The architectural quality of Graceland, judged by conventional standards, is unremarkable. The Moore family's original 1939 design was competent neoclassical revival, pleasant but not innovative. Elvis's modifications, while culturally revealing, were not architecturally significant in terms of structural innovation or spatial sophistication. Graceland's importance lies not in how it was built, but in what it preserved. A complete record of one man's attempt to construct, through architecture and decoration, a world that could contain and protect him. That attempt failed. The world Elvis built at Graceland could not ultimately shield him from his own vulnerabilities or from the forces, internal and external, that eroded his health and will. The fortress could not save him. But the fortress has survived him, outlasted him by decades, and in surviving has become something he could not have anticipated. Not a private refuge, but a public monument. Not a home, but a museum. Not a barrier, but a gateway. Graceland today operates as a machine for memory, converting personal history into public experience, transforming private spaces into ticketed attractions, maintaining through endless renovation the illusion of permanence. The house appears unchanging, but this appearance requires constant change, repairs, replacements, interventions. What visitors experience as authenticity is actually a carefully curated performance of authenticity, a simulation so faithful to the original that the distinction between preservation and reconstruction becomes philosophically murky. Yet within this simulation, genuine traces remain. The limestone steps of the staircase bear the wear of Elvis's footsteps among the millions that have followed. The jungle room's shag carpet, despite protection and periodic replacement, retains some strands from the original installation. The graves in the meditation garden hold actual bodies, not symbolic representations. Graceland is haunted not by ghosts, but by the persistent materiality of the past, the stubborn fact that Elvis was real, lived here, died here, and remains here. The final image, the one that closes this documentary examination of an architectural paradox, returns to the staircase in early morning, before the gates open and the tours begin. The house stands empty of visitors, its rooms silent, except for the hum of climate control systems maintaining the 1977 climate. Light filters through the stained glass of the front door, casting colored shadows on the white walls of the entrance hall. The staircase rises into dimness, the padded door at its summit closed as always. Down below, through the front windows, the gates are visible. The musical note gates installed in 1957, their iron forms silhouetted against the lightening sky. In a few hours, those gates will open, and the visitors will stream in, cameras ready, moving through the choreographed tour, marveling at the jungle room, falling silent at the meditation garden, and pausing here, at the base of the stairs, looking up toward the sealed second floor. What they see is architecture, limestone and oak, carpet and plaster, the physical structure of a house. What they sense, if they're paying attention, is the accumulated weight of isolation, the price extracted by the isolation system that Elvis built around himself. The house was designed to keep the world out, but in the end, it only succeeded in keeping him in. The fortress could not repel what threatened him, because what threatened him was not outside the walls, but inside them, in the sealed master bedroom, in the chemically mediated nights, in the solitude that no amount of company could relieve. The house has survived by becoming something its builder never intended: transparent, accessible, public. It endures not as a private refuge, but as a shared space where millions come to remember, to mourn, to celebrate, to gawk, to connect with a phenomenon that changed American culture. It stands as evidence that Elvis was real, that the icon had a physical location, that the king lived in a house with shag carpet and made choices, some brilliant, some baffling, some tragic, about how to occupy that space. The upstairs remains closed. This may be the most important thing to say about Graceland, that even now, even transformed into America's second most visited house, even open to millions and converted into a business, the sealed second floor preserves a final boundary. Behind the padded door, Elvis retains what he could not maintain in life: privacy, dignity, distance from the consuming gaze. The house stands. The gates open. The visitors come. The tours continue. The architecture that was meant to isolate has become the architecture that connects, bringing together people from every continent to stand in rooms where the king once lived. The silent staircase, rising toward its sealed threshold, frames the question that Graceland poses but will never answer. What remains when privacy collapses? When the fortress fails? When the king dies but his palace endures? Stone, glass, shag carpet, and memory. A house frozen in time, not because time stopped, but because endless labor maintains the illusion. Architecture that sought permanence and achieved it through surrender, surviving by admitting the very forces it was built to exclude. In the end, the limestone walls of Graceland achieved their original purpose, though not for the man who transformed them. They have withstood the erosion of economy, the judgment of critics, and the passage of decades. Today, the house stands as a paradox, a place of total exposure that keeps its deepest secret locked away on the second floor. Elvis built it to hide from the world, and now the world comes to stare at the hiding place. The silence upstairs is the only thing that remains truly his.